Welcome back. In this module, I'll try and answer some quite reasonable questions, like how much fat should I be eating, when should I be eating it, what fat, and related to that, what are good sources of healthy fat. The first question is one of those how long is a piece of string questions. How much fat would benefit you the most depends on the type of diet you follow, your total energy needs, and the health of your metabolism, as well as your nutrition, health, and performance-related goals. There's also an element of genetics in there. Now, despite what some diet gurus may claim, there is certainly no one-size-fits-all solution. And that is also why I always encourage people to make strategic changes to their diet, so something you're recording, something you're quantifying to a reasonable degree, and then seeing what happens. How you feel, what are your blood tests showing you, how is your performance going? If a key goal is weight reduction, well, how is that progressing? Or if it's body composition change, how is that going? Now, having said that, most people are going to do well either actively restricting their fat intake or actively restricting their carbohydrate intake. What about when? There isn't really a best time to have fat. Now, in another module, I will cover when to eat carbohydrates, which has a bit more research behind it as well as a bit more logic. But in general, with fat, as a rule, when a meal is already high in carbohydrates, keep the fat content down, and when the meal is low in carbohydrates, fat can be a bit higher. Now, having said that, any large meal with a substantial amount of fat and or protein and also carbohydrates is going to slow down how quickly we absorb, let's say, those carbohydrates. So that can be a positive thing. It all gets a little bit nuanced here. But for most people, a diet that is both very high in carbohydrates and very high in fat is simply going to be too high in energy to sustain health. There are going to be exceptions if you have a very high energy output. It's a case of matching energy needs with what you're eating. I will say that there should be at least a little bit of healthy fat in every meal or snack, as we don't just need fats for their own sake, for energy and structure and so on, covered in another module, but also to help us absorb fat-soluble vitamins in our food and any supplements we might be taking. So I would recommend that every meal does contain some fat if there are going to be fat-soluble vitamins consumed at the same time. Now, the second question is a little bit more straightforward to answer. Avoid industrial trans fats to the absolute best of your ability. These have never been shown to have any health benefits, quite the opposite. There is ample evidence and a broad agreement that these are detrimental to health. Saturated fat, on the other hand, remains hotly debated, and no doubt will for some time because here the specifics actually matter. Saturated fats differ in what they do to us. For example, some saturated fatty acids raise what some call good cholesterol, others raise what some call bad cholesterol. Both are misnomers. They're unfortunate attempts to make something simpler than it actually is. Cholesterol is just cholesterol, and the measurements of cholesterol in blood tests is divided up based on what is transporting that cholesterol, namely the lipoproteins, which include low-density lipoproteins, or LDL, that you might hear about, and the high-density lipoproteins, or HDL, that you might also hear about. And that may be the topic of a future module. Back to saturated fat. Lumping all saturated fats together is unhelpful, precisely because their effect on physiology varies. Also, how saturated fats affect us depends on what else we are eating, not just at the time, but overall. Carbohydrates and different forms of carbohydrates also can have a potent effect on cholesterol concentrations, or specifically those low-density lipoproteins and those high-density lipoproteins. So it isn't all just about fat, or about saturated fat. In any case, whatever the science ends up settling on in terms of the pros and cons, saturated fats are certainly not the demons of the food world some have and continue to make them out to be. They are just another type of nutrient that has its place in the diet, and that needs to be modified on an individual basis. Now, for starters, oils and fats that contain a lot of saturated fat are good cooking options, as they are stable, meaning they can be used for cooking at high heat without being chemically altered. Have a look at the smoke point of different fats and oils. You can see that tallow is a better option for high heat cooking than lard, sesame oil, or olive oil, for example. Moving on, monounsaturated fats remain the darling of the nutrition community and should make up the bulk of the fats and oils in your diet, whether that diet is overall high or low in fat. Again, at least in the majority of cases for the majority of people. Polyunsaturated fats are tricky because there are two types, really three, but two of them in many ways have opposite effects to each other. We need them both, but the ratios can matter. Most people would therefore do well to have some so-called fish oil and limit seed oils. When cooking with oil, try to avoid getting it so hot that it smokes. Smoky oil is not only unpleasant on the nose and eyes, but also signals that the oil is undergoing chemical reactions. So it's changing into something less than healthy. The specific smoke point of an oil depends on a lot of factors, so there are no temperatures presented here. But you can see that beef tallow is going to survive a higher heat than, say, extra virgin olive oil. The studies I've looked at on oxidation, in other words, damage to oil, basically show that lower temperatures are better, but that smoke point is not always a good indicator of how stable an oil is. Olive oil, for example, seems to be the most resistant to damage of similar oils simply based on its antioxidant content. And basically, it's a good idea to keep most, if not all, oils below 180 degrees Celsius when cooking. Now for me, that means cooking lower and sometimes slower, and adding uncooked oil once the cooking is done if I want the extra oil, let's say, for energy. It's also worth repeating here that fats and oils in food aren't one type of fatty acid or one category of fat. Remember the first module. For example, olive oil is high in monounsaturated fats, but also contains saturated fats. Fat from red meat is often given the broad brush label of saturated, but actually also contains a substantial amount of monounsaturated fats, and so on. Now, on the topic of polyunsaturated fats, you may recall there are three types: the omega-3s, omega-6s, or omega-9s, often also written as N3, N6, and N9. These oils, among other things, are the basis of signals involved in inflammation. Now, inflammation is a survival mechanism that helps us stay healthy and thrive in a world full of bacteria, viruses, and parasites. Inflammation is also part of healing after an injury, and even after exercise. Chronic inflammation, though, that's inflammation that doesn't go away when it's no longer needed, is a problem. Chronic inflammation is a common theme in many of the conditions we associate with modern life, from type 2 diabetes and heart disease to arthritis. And a growing and increasingly convincing body of work also suggests that inflammation, specifically of the brain, influences mood and cognitive conditions. So think things like depression or the consequences of traumatic brain injury. Having an adequate amount of long-chain omega-3 or N3 fats, as I said before, often also called fish oil, can help reduce inflammation as well as modify the blood lipids, say in a blood test. If you aren't already eating tuna, salmon, mackerel, and similar deep-sea fish a few times per week, invest in some fish or krill oil. Because the larger fish, especially tuna, can also be a source of heavy metals, it's worth looking for a supplement that undergoes third-party testing, both for its specific content of different oils. The ones you're looking for are EPA, eicosapentaenoic acid, and DHA, docosahexaenoic acid, and testing that looks at contaminants such as mercury. In general, you get what you pay for. Compare labels and go for the option that has the highest EPA and DHA content per 1,000 milligrams. The EPA and DHA are the fats that have the benefits, so it's better to pay extra for a capsule with a higher concentration and take fewer capsules. Please also note that how much a person should be taking depends on whether they have a specific condition that they're trying to treat or if they're just looking for general, let's say, heart health. Follow the advice on the label for a week or so and see what happens. Now, people taking blood thinning medication should definitely run this past their doctor because a high-ish consumption of these fish oils can also lead to blood thinning. For vegetarians and vegans, there are fish oil alternatives, usually made from algae, which is actually where the fish get their EPA and DHA from. It actually originates in the algae, not the fish. The fish just concentrate it for us. So check online or your local health food store if you're interested, or your local pharmacy, and make sure that the product does indeed contain EPA and DHA, as many oils might be labeled, or supplements might be labeled as omega-3 rich, for example, flaxseed oil, but they do not contain these specific fats. They would rely on your body to convert the fat that is in, let's say, the flaxseed oil to EPA and DHA, which it can do to some extent, but not to the extent that, or to the benefit that you'll get from taking the oil already formed. That brings us to the last question. What are good sources of fat? Again, there is some debate here, and I don't want this to be the absolute definitive answer on that, but I'll take you through some of the logic to what I believe. The first answer is whole foods. Whole foods are undeniably the best sources of fat. And by that I mean minimally processed foods you have had to prepare and, if it requires cooking, cook yourself. Again, as I said before, preferably at low heat. Things like nuts, seeds, and vegetables are good sources of healthy fat, if that fat comes in the form of those nuts, seeds, and vegetables. The second answer is cold-pressed oils, sometimes also called extra virgin oils. It doesn't just apply to extra virgin olive oil. You can cold press other oils. These oils, which will be labeled as cold pressed or extra virgin, have not been processed or extracted using heat or solvents. And that's important because remember, many fatty acids are quite sensitive to heat and even light, hence the preference for cold extraction. And while, yes, generally processes are used to remove solvents from oil, we don't really want to have to deal with any leftover solvents in our system. Again, keep in mind that individual responses will vary, but a simple routine blood test before and after any dietary change will help show if you're going in the right direction. Now, there is more advanced testing out there, and that can sometimes tell us more. There is also genetic testing, but that's certainly beyond the scope of this beginner's coverage.